Buckle up, Buttercup, because Microsoft has released the source code to MS-DOS 4.0, and get this, it doesn't actually compile. This isn't a joke. This is a real thing that happened. What's more, Microsoft and ex-Microsoft employees are actively editing the source code that they already published just like 2 days ago. This historical 40-year-old source code to remove and modify comments that they don't want the public looking at. They literally called the creator of DOS brain damaged in some of the comments, and they're editing that out as we speak. This is totally real. This is hilarious, awesome, weird, all sorts of stuff. I wrote an article on this yesterday, but I simply have to talk about it today. I'm going to read some of the pieces of the article here to catch you up, but you can go read the rest of it with all the links and the screenshots and everything over at lunduk.locals.com. Before we dive in, I want to say how absolutely on the nose it is that every tech news publication on planet Earth is writing a story this week about how great it is that Microsoft released the source code for MS-DOS 4.0. Hallelujah. And they're freaking out about it. And they're, this is scratching that nostalgia itch and how great it is. And you could go and take this code and build it and run it. And here's a bunch of virtual machines you could run it in. And not one of them, not one, actually tried to build the source code because it is broken. It is mangled. They did not test it when they released it. Oh my heavens. That tells you, without question, that the tech publications, the tech journalists out there, they take whatever Microsoft or any other big company says, they take it at face value, and they do absolutely zero investigation into whether or not it's real or not. Whether it's a tech thing or a business thing or political thing, doesn't matter. They don't check into it at all. But we do. All right, I'm going to read some of this for you real quick. Yesterday, well, I guess 2 days ago now, Microsoft released the source code for MS-DOS 4.0, an action which I personally encouraged Microsoft to take for many years, including when I worked at Microsoft. I used to work at Microsoft in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and me and several other employees were regularly pushing Microsoft management to authorize the release both of source code, documentation, scanned documents, some of the stuff from the museum, as well as just binaries of unused decades-old software, versions of DOS, original versions of Windows, or original versions of Multiplan and things like that, just for historical preservation purposes. While I got tons of pushback on it. Now, and while this source code release of MS-DOS 4.0 is definitely a big win for the preservation of computer history in a huge way, I don't want to mince words here. I love that this is out there, and I've already had a ton of fun combing through the archives. There are some rather ridiculous issues with it. The top two that spring to mind. First is that the source doesn't actually compile. It doesn't. Some of the parts of it build and can be verified, and others don't, but you cannot actually use it. It's not usable in its current state. And the second is that the source has been modified by Microsoft after it got published publicly, right? So we have a GitHub record of the changes made. Part of the problem here is that reduces the historical value of the code. It also calls our attention to the specific changes being made, which are hilarious, and I'll talk about those in a moment. The third thing, Microsoft claims to have lost some of the source code for some related products, which I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm calling shenanigans on that one. But the first bullet point, you read that right. It does not compile. I'll walk you through the details, including a step-by-step guide for how you can fail to compile MS-DOS 4.0 yourself. Fail to compile DOS 4 at home in these easy steps. But first, a little bit of a backstory is in order. We need to talk about what this actually is, because it is a little bit weird and confusing. MS-DOS 4.0 was released back in 1986, and it's a bit of an oddity. It was a multitasking version of DOS, similar in that way to Wenden DOS. If you know what Wenden DOS is, it's a multitasking DOS. And importantly, it was not, I repeat, not a direct continuation of the existing MS-DOS line. So there's MS-DOS 3.1, 3.2, and then 4.0 came out, but 4.0 was a completely different thing. MS-DOS 3.x was single tasking, MS-DOS 4 was multitasking in a totally different code base. And in fact, MS-DOS 3.3 came out after version 4.0. This is a real thing. I want to make a quick side note here that there are many versions of DOS, types of DOS, DOS-based operating systems that handle multitasking or ways that you can multitask with DOS. I linked to an article I wrote in this article where you can go and check out some of those different ways. Just because a lot of people think, oh, it's DOS, it doesn't do multitasking. That's actually not true. There are both cooperative and preemptive multitasking versions of DOS out there. Anyway, I digress. So this multitasking DOS 4.0, it was a flop. It was not commercially successful at all. It failed spectacularly, and it was quickly abandoned. It was shelved. It was relegated to history, and they just stopped talking about it. As luck would have it, IBM, who had a development agreement in place with Microsoft, remember this all goes back to when IBM went to Microsoft to create an operating system for their early personal computer line. Microsoft then purchased or licensed at the time an operating system called Quick and Dirty DOS from a Seattle-based company and rebranded that as both PC-DOS, IBM PC-DOS, and Microsoft MS-DOS. So they had a development agreement already in place, and IBM continued developing that single tasking branch of DOS based on MS-DOS 3.1, 3.2, etc., and they called it PC-DOS 4 or later MS-DOS 4. However, and I'm going to be very clear about this, this was a completely different version of MS-DOS 4.0 than the MS-DOS 4.0 that was multitasking that had already just been released, right? They had nothing to do with each other, very different feature sets, totally different code bases. It was ridiculous. So, it was buggy. It was super buggy. This PC-DOS 4, which became MS-DOS 4, was legendarily buggy. It had all sorts of problems with memory management, so a lot of applications that could run in MS-DOS 3.2 couldn't run in MS-DOS 4. It was a problem. And ultimately, when it became obvious that this multitasking version of MS-DOS 4 was a dead end, Microsoft took IBM's modifications, that totally unrelated DOS 4.0, and released it also with the MS-DOS 4.0 names. So two different operating systems, totally different, right? They could run some of the same software, but totally different. And they had the same name and the same version number, because that's not at all confusing. This was a crazy, crazy marketing move by Microsoft. It was insane. It was stupid. And when we're talking about the history of this stuff, it makes things just incredibly complicated. So, because it was so buggy, Microsoft and IBM quickly had versions that became known as 4.01, and MS-DOS 4.01 really became the most used version of MS-DOS 4. So MS-DOS 4.01, it had some success. It was still a bit buggy, but it had some success. All right, so that's the history of that. There's really two totally different versions of MS-DOS 4.0 that are unrelated to each other. So, what exactly did Microsoft just release the source code for? Because I've seen some articles that have gotten this profoundly wrong. And once again, tech journalists, please do your friggin' homework before you report on these things. So there's two parts. There's two parts to this release. The first is a source code dump, right? And this is great. This contains the complete source code for the IBM developed non-multitasking version of MS-DOS 4.0. Very, very cool. As well as, and this is very, very neat, not the source code, but floppy disk images of the multitask version of what would later become MS-DOS 4.0, the multitasking version. In fact, this was from 1984, 2 years prior to the release of the multitasking version. It was just simply called multitasking DOS at that point. Now, this doesn't have any source code available, other than it has some source for BIOS-related images that they shipped off to some original equipment manufacturers, but that's about it there. But it does have the binaries for it, which means you can actually take this for a test drive for the most part. There are later, more complete versions of the multitasking version of MS-DOS 4 that are already out there in the wild, so this isn't necessarily anything new for people who have been wanting to play with this for some time. However, because it is earlier, it's a really interesting historical snapshot. And this also includes some scanned documentation, which is really nice. Anytime that happens, it's a very, very nice thing. So here's pictures of that multitasking MS-DOS beta release from 1984, the floppies. Confidential stamped right on them. It's very, very, very cool that came out. Now, both of those releases are available on GitHub. And all of it, I want to repeat, all of it is released under the MIT license, which means that yes, Virginia, you can if you can get that single tasking MS-DOS 4.0 code to build, you can in theory fork these releases and continue to develop them. That's pretty cool. Though you'll need to change the name because Microsoft still holds the trademark on Microsoft name, on MS-DOS, on all of these things. So you'll need to change quite a few strings if you want to do that, but you could do that. Now, here's the thing. I want to make a little bit of a side note here, that this work was announced in a joint blog post by two guys, Jeff Wilcox, who is the head of the Open Source Programs Office at Microsoft, and Scott Hanselman, the Vice President of Developer Community at Microsoft. Now, I've linked to their announcement, which was very light on details, but you've linked to it anyway for completeness. But I'm also linking to an article that I wrote not too long back. This is a side note here. Total side note. That vice president, Scott Hanselman, is the same Microsoft executive, and many of you have followed my work for some time, who has previously encouraged people, this is a real thing, to commit crimes against people based on their skin color and gender. This is a very, very real thing. Telling people in a large audience as a representative of Microsoft that they should be, quote, ready to go to jail for those crimes. And he didn't do it, it wasn't a joke. And while that bit of information has nothing to do with this source code release, it's nice to have background on the people we're talking about, right? It's nice to add a little color commentary to the individuals involved. That doesn't take away from the awesomeness of releasing some source code, but worth noting that that guy wants you to go commit crimes against people based on their skin color. I linked to that article, make of that what you will. So, what code exactly did we get here? Because this we really need to dive into this. This release from Microsoft is a valuable and interesting one. I want to make this very, very clear. I'm not poo-pooing the release at all. It contains great historical and very historically significant information. I'm filled to the brim with nerdy joy, as I put it, as I go through this. I really am. It's just delightful. Unfortunately, it does not include code for the multitasking version of 4.0. And I bring this up for one specific reason. From the announcement, quote, Jeff Wilcox and the Open Source Programs Office went to the Microsoft archives, and while they were unable to find the full source code for the multitasking DOS, they did find MS-DOS 4.00, which is the single tasking version, which we're releasing today alongside these additional beta binaries, PDFs, and documentation and disk images of the multitasking version. We will continue to explore the archives and may update this release if more is discovered. Now that caused my eyebrow to go up a little bit. As I mentioned, I used to work at Microsoft. I worked at Microsoft in a number of different departments for a number of different years during the 1990s and early 2000s, and I find this statement weird. I don't believe it. No, that's not to say I'm describing some sort of weird malicious motives here. I just don't buy this. Not at all. During my time working at Microsoft, I knew of backed up copies of source code for darn near everything. Certainly everything from some point in the 80s onwards. Yes, some of that very early stuff, it does get lost. But a lot of the people that work at Microsoft are really into this stuff. And for a variety of reasons, both business, legal, historical, and just plain nerdiness, a lot of that stuff gets packed up and really, really, really effectively backed up. I've personally seen source code for pretty much every version of MS-DOS from 3.3 onward. And that's just what I personally saw poking around at things. I wasn't even working on DOS, but I wanted to see if we had them. And it took me like 5 minutes and I found them. They were on file servers backed up with binary releases. And then here's the source code. And they were all over the place. All over the place. It was crazy. Now, yet, they were unable to find, assuming they did an extensive search, the code for multitasking DOS 4? Really? A historically significant one with that late in the game? Now, knowing intimately how the various groups within Microsoft handled backing up of source code and binaries for these releases, that statement from Microsoft makes me, my eyebrow goes through the roof. I'm skeptical, man. I don't buy it at all. Companies lose source code all the time. It happens. It really does. In this case, though, knowing exactly how they used to do things, not that long ago? Not buying it. Unless Microsoft, as I put it, completely forgot how to back up source code in the last few years, since they bought GitHub, I'm going to call this claim utterly bogus. I gotta shoot this one down. I don't know what's going on. Maybe they didn't know what they were looking for. Maybe they aren't that familiar with the Microsoft networks or systems. Maybe someone took a torch to all the Microsoft servers that were there. I don't know, but no. So let's look at this, because here's an interesting sidebar. Is what we got here actually MS-DOS 4.0? Because just to make everything far more confusing than it already is, this may not actually be MS-DOS 4.0. It might be MS-DOS 4.01 or PC-DOS 4.01 or, and this seems actually pretty likely, a strange combination or an interim build between 4.0 and 4.01. Now, just to give you a little example of what we're talking about here, take a look at the set environment batch file, the set-env-bat in the source code. It's a very simple file. It's got maybe 7-8 lines in it, and it simply sets up your build environment. Just a little batch file. At the very top, it says, echo, setting up system to build the MS-DOS 4.01 source back. Okay. Now, what that means is that's not 4.0, it's 4.01. However, what files I have been able to build, right, which I can't build all of them, but which ones have been able to build appear to exactly match the 4.0, the MS-DOS 4.0 release images, because those have been publicly available forever because it was publicly released. And I've double checked it against the binaries. They are a perfect match for each other. However, being as some of the source code release is mangled beyond use, right? Unfortunately, we can't really be sure that everything matches the actual 4.0 release. It might be an interim build between 4.0 and 4.01. Perhaps it's right after the 4.0 launch as they were beginning work on 4.01. We really don't know. Oh, but that brings us to the fun bit. I did mention, right, that the source code doesn't successfully build. This is both fantastic and annoying and amusing and awful and all sorts of things all just rolled into one. Let's talk about this. So I'm going to repeat myself because I want to be clear. The code that has been supplied by Microsoft contains significant problems which will prohibit it from compiling a complete working version of MS-DOS 4.0. It just will. I attempted to build under multiple environments, including on released versions of MS-DOS 4.01, MS-DOS 5. I also used earlier versions of MS-DOS, PC-DOS, and under DOSBox. And I dug through the errors and the code until I was confident of what the issues were. And importantly, I was confident that we weren't simply looking at an obvious case of user error, because, let's be honest, that can sort of happen. Now, as luck would have it, I've done this before. Back when I worked at Microsoft, because I was there and I had access to DOS code, I have built multiple versions of DOS and compiled multiple versions of DOS back in the day from source. So this isn't my first rodeo with this. I knew what I was looking at. So here's a screenshot of DOSBox showing one of the first errors that you get. It's in an assembly file called getMessage, getmsg, and it has a bit of an error there. And it turns out that error is actually fairly simple to fix. But note, if you want to skip over this, you can't because you're in the video. If you were just reading the article, you could skip down to the next section. So here's how you do it. First, you want to go download the contents of the MS-DOS 4.0 GitHub repository. I provide links for all of this in the article itself. I'll link to the article wherever you're getting this video or podcast. Download the whole GitHub repository for MS-DOS 4.0. Note, you do not want or need the root of that GitHub repository. You just want the MS-DOS 4.0 non-Aussie branch, because the Aussie branch has no source code in it. You want the non-Aussie branch. I link exactly to what you want in the article. And then you want to install DOSBox. Any version of DOSBox will do. DOSBox, DOSBox X, it doesn't matter. Because seriously, it works just as well in DOSBox as it does in an emulator or real hardware running any version of MS or PC or even DR-DOS. It's the same pretty much across the board. You're not going to have any issues. The build process just isn't that complicated. Now, within DOSBox, what you're going to want to do to make this easy for yourself is you're going to want to mount that MS-DOS 4.0 GitHub repository directory as your D drive. So what you do in DOSBox, it's very simple. You type mount D for D drive, and then supply your local path on your host machine of where that MS-DOS 4.0 folder is or directory is. And if you did everything correctly, you will now within DOSBox, and I'll show you a little picture of this here, have a D drive with a directory that just has an SRC, a source directory in it, and that's it. That's perfect. And why you want that is that the batch files and make files, which MS-DOS 4.0 expects, all have it hard-coded to the D drive SRC, right? That's the folder, that's the directory where everything is supposed to be. Now, it's very simple to go in and modify these files and modify all the batch files and whatnot to point to a C drive or an R drive or point to them wherever you want. But by doing it this way, you don't have to touch a single line of a batch file. It just will all work. You are exactly replicating the build environment that they would use at Microsoft. Very, very simple. You don't have to tweak any files. Now, to actually do the build, dog simple. Change to your D drive SRC directory. If you're not familiar with DOS, D : hit enter. That changes to your D drive. And then do CD space SRC. That will change you to your source directory. Now you run that setenv-bat file we talked about earlier. Just type that in. It will run a batch file that will set all of your directory stuff up. Mostly it's things like setting your path and variables so it knows where to find various binary files. And one of the really big important ones is something called nmake, which is very needed for running these makes, right? So run nmake from your source, from your SRC directory, type nmake and hit enter. That literally, if everything is copacetic, if everything is kosher with all your files, is the last major step you need to do. You also need to copy some of the executables around. There's a batch file in the SRC directory to do that will automate that process, which is not necessary to automate, but it helps. But you're not going to get that far because wha-bam, you're going to get errors right out of the gate. Let's see, where's the errors at? You will quickly see that several files compile cleanly, which is great. You'll start to get object files built all over the place. It's fantastic until you get to getmsg.asm, and then if you fix that, which is actually really easy to do, you can get to usa.inf, and that one will fail. There's a couple others that fail after that as well. Now, both of these files are mangled to one degree or another. compiler. Now you're able to force get msg.asm to compile by commenting out or by removing a commented line, basically. But usa.inf is completely hosed. Now here's the problem. usa.inf has within it a huge amount of characters. I'm just going to give you, some of the background of this. It has a large number of characters that are in a particular code page. Whoever posted this completely mangled it. It looks like they copied that text file, opened it in a really old version of Microsoft Word, copied it over to a Unicode document, and then opened it up on a machine that didn't support Unicode and saved it there. Like it just completely mangled a whole bunch of it. Which means it is possible to get this code to compile if you completely modify those source files, usa.inf being one of the more complex ones that you have to modify. Unfortunately, when you do that, you're just simply guessing at what characters are going into the places that just got ultimately mangled, and you're going to introduce lots of bugs. What you're going to have is going to be a version of MS-DOS 4.0 that, while it will compile, is not the released version of MS-DOS 4.0. What you will end up having is you will have rewritten some code, replaced some files, and you'll have something that's like MS-DOS 4.0 adjacent, right? It's not really MS-DOS 4. It's going to be buggier already, which is saying something. It's not going to work the same. Certain things are not going to look the same. It's going to have some problems that you were just not going to expect when you start diving in and actually trying to use it. Which means from a both usable perspective, it's hosed, it's borked, it's toasted. And from a historical perspective, it's not as good, because what we don't have is MS-DOS 4. What we then have is a set of source code that, if we modify it, we get an MS-DOS 4 adjacent system, which is cool, but not great, right? Considering this code clearly exists in a fine state somewhere, Microsoft just needs to figure out what process that they did to screw everything up and re-release that code. It's just a couple of files they really dorked up. Get those re-released out here, and then we can actually build a system that could be bit for bit identical to the MS-DOS 4.0 release. But as it stands currently, it does not build without significant source code modifications and changes. And then even then, you still don't have a real functional identical system to MS-DOS 4. What's crazy to me is that means that people in Microsoft were so excited about this release, but they didn't test it. They were excited about a source code release that they did not test out when they released it. No, I get testing in production. I get it. But did no one at Microsoft do the announcement and say, cool, it's out. Let me download that real quick and run a couple of batch files and see if it builds? Not one person at Microsoft did that. Really? Really? Nobody? There's tens of thousands of Microsoft employees on main campus, and nobody did that and raised a flag that said, hey, there's a couple of bugs. Let's go ahead and fix those real quick. Nobody? Still not fixed. I posted this article yesterday. I know they've seen it. They still haven't fixed it, and it has to be an easy fix. Come on, guys. I would like to make a side note here, because this is crazy to me. After Microsoft announced the source code, after they announced that they put out the source code for MS-DOS 4.0, a huge number of articles popped up on I say a number of tech news sites, but it's exploded since then. Tech news sites all over the place. Tech Twitter people, everyone's like, yeah, woohoo. They're super excited, right? They've picked up on this news and they have praised this release. They yell about how awesome it is, and this itches my journalistic or my nostalgia funny bone, and I'm so excited. And they talk about how great it is because, oh man, now you can just build MS-DOS 4 and run it in an emulator. Here, you could grab VirtualBox and run it, and you could grab QEMU and run it. And none of them actually tried to run it. None of them. Not one tech journalists, not one, not a single one, reported that the code doesn't actually compile. I'm the only one. Not just the only one so far, I'm the only one, period. Now, since this has come out, I've seen a couple other people who have been trying to make the build and go, oh yeah. And I saw a blog post from someone who's big into computer history who was trying to do the same thing and starting to encounter some of the same errors. But all the tech journalists, nope. They haven't even tried. They didn't even give it a spin. What in the heavens? And as you'll see, they didn't even look on GitHub to see what changes were being made. Yeah, they did zero investigative journalism at all. And we're not talking about digging into records here. We're not I mean, the Lunduk Journal does this all the time. I go into IRS records and public audits and financial reports and annual reports. And I dig into all of these big companies and all these big foundations regularly. None of them do, but the Lunduk Journal does it. We're not even talking about any of that. We're just simply talking about quickly kicking the tires of the thing that just got announced. Microsoft announces the source code for MS-DOS 4. What do you do with that? You compile it and then see if it's there. None of them did it. Not one. The Register talked about it, and ZDNet talked about it, and they're all talking about it. And they're all like, oh, so great, I'm covering this cool thing. And they did none. They did not check on it at all. I'm going to go ahead and let you draw your own conclusions about all of that. But the Lunduk Journal actually tried things out and actually looked into it, and it doesn't work. Holy heavens. Now here's a fun bit. The historical record here, the source code has actually been compromised a little bit beyond just those manglings. Now, it doesn't build. That's a problem, right? It's a problem that some of the things got mangled and some of the code got corrupted and it doesn't build. Okay, that's one problem. And it's also a little bit hard to be 100% sure what the specific release actually is. Is it 4.0? Is it 4.01? Is it the variant from IBM or Microsoft? They both kind of have some similarities there. It looks like it's probably an interim build right after the 4.0 release, so it's mostly 4.0, but there's some weird bits in here like some of the build files and whatnot that could really use some clarification, right? It's not 100% obvious exactly which revision we're talking about here. And from a historical perspective, that's important, right? Because there were significant changes between 4.0 and 4.01 of the single tasking variant of MS-DOS that we need to know about. I mean, some really significant fixes. But put all that aside for a minute. What makes this even worse is that not only has some of the code been mangled and corrupted, but some of the code comments were actively modified in the few hours after the source code was publicly posted. This is totally a real thing. Like the source code gets dropped, boom, this week, and in a few hours later, someone comes along and makes a modification to the source code repository, which no one is supposed to be modifying. So this further destroys the historical value of the source code, which, to put it mildly, kind of sucks. That kind of sucks. From a historical perspective, I want to see the source code exactly as it was. I don't want it changed. I don't want any of it changed. I want the files changed. I don't want the folder structure changed. I don't want the comments changed. Well, let's talk about brain damaged Tim Patterson. As luck would have it, the source code change is really kind of amusing and pretty minor. I mean, I'm not saying that someone went in and changed a million lines of source code here. They changed like one line, 2 lines really. And I'm going to show you the exact lines here. The first line says, brain damaged Tim Patterson ignored his in case his BIOS did not flush the input queue, and brain damaged Tim Patterson was modified to brain damaged TP. Okay, all right. It's a simple change. The only real change here is obscuring an insult of Tim Patterson. Now, who is Tim Patterson? Tim Patterson is the original creator of Quick and Dirty DOS, the DOS that Microsoft licensed and then ultimately purchased from Seattle Computer Company to bring it in and create MS-DOS and PC-DOS, right? That's what it originally was Quick and Dirty DOS. Now, Tim he was the dev lead of MS-DOS for the 1.0 release, right? So MS-DOS 1.0, that was Tim. Now, he was then said that he was brain damaged in the comments for MS-DOS 4.0. Okay, but they changed his name to TP for some reason. Now, if it's a historical record, these small changes should not be occurring. We should leave them in just as they were, right? It's a small change and it's on the record, but we can figure it out. Now, here's a fun question to ask, though. This is where it gets really fun, in my opinion. Who exactly made this change, right? Microsoft is not accepting any outside changes to this source code repository at all. They make a big point of that one, right? They're saying it's for historical purposes only, so they're not accepting changes. So whoever made this change has the blessing of Microsoft to go in and make this change. Well, it's GitHub, so we have access to all of that. So hold on to your butts, ladies and gentlemen. This change was made by a GitHub user with the name of MZBIK, with the simple comment. This was a whole bunch of changes were grouped all in together, and it included this comment change about brain damaged Tim Patterson with the simple comment. The only comment was MZ is back! Exclamation point. What? MZ is back? Well, great, but who the heck is MZ and why is MZ back? You might be asking. I'll tell you who MZ is. It is none other than the absolute legend, Mark Zbigowski. I can't say your name right, Mark. My apologies. One of the early Microsoft employees. Mark joined Microsoft back in '81, and he was the programmer who took over MS-DOS from Tim Patterson. So starting with version 2.0 and on, he was leading MS-DOS all the way up through MS-DOS 4, this release, right? He was the man. This is Mark. This is Mark Zbikowski. And oh my gosh, look at that mustache. That is a man right there. I love it. Great stash, Mark. Great stash. Absolutely fantastic. Now, clearly, this is fascinating to me. Clearly, Mark, who usurped Tim as the dev lead and manager of MS-DOS, did not want that little brain-damaged insult of Tim to be part of the historical record, right? Or perhaps he really wanted to call attention to it, right? Maybe he's like, I'm going to apply the Streisand effect here, and I'm going to change it just to call attention to it because he thinks it's funny. I don't know what the motivation was, but either way, we can now be somewhat sure that Mark Zbikowski himself wrote that comment way back in the 1980s. Now, we don't know exactly when that comment arrived. It could have come in the MS-DOS 4 project. It could have come in all the way back in MS-DOS 2.0, anywhere in there. So there's many years where that comment could have been made, right? But he likely is the guy who wrote it. Likely. We don't know for sure because we don't have the commit logs from Microsoft back in the 80s. But even more fascinating, Mark remembered that comment, right? From the 80s, from 40 years ago, so clearly that he knew to quickly go and change it almost immediately once the source code was made public. Right? So boom, he saw source code drop and he's like, wait a minute. I called Tim Patterson brain damaged. I better go change that. Toot sweet. Right? He remembered that instantly and he was on it. Right? He looked through it. He's like, no. We're going to just call this TP. What's amazing to me is that I barely remember source code comments that I wrote last week. Heck, yesterday. Let alone 40 years ago. I mean, I can guarantee you, when I was working at Microsoft, I wrote code comments back in the 90s, and that was not even 30 years ago, right? That was 20 plus years ago. No idea what any of those comments were. And I guarantee you, those comments included insults of some of my coworkers. couldn't begin to tell you what those insults were or even what those code workers' names might have been, but I guarantee you they're in there, and I don't remember them. But Mark, oh, he remembered this one. and this level of whimsy, of irreverent whimsy of one historically massively significant programmer insulting another historically significant programmer in the source code comments for one of the most historically significant pieces of software. Oh, that makes me smile. And now they're kind of trying to cover it up or draw attention to it or something. I don't know, but it makes me smile. I absolutely love that that's happening. I'm going to comb through all of this code, and I'm going to see what other comments are absolutely delightful in there. If anyone finds any good ones, let me know, because I'm excited for that. And again, I need to be very clear about this. This change is not a huge deal, right? It's a very minor, non-functional change, right? In fact, I'm kind of glad that it now happened because it drew my attention to this absolutely adorable quote where the guy who ran MS-DOS for several years called the creator of MS-DOS brain damaged. That's very entertaining to me. But what else has changed, right? What else will be changed? What was changed before it was even posted to GitHub? Is there a way to know? It feels like it's worth asking this just for the preservation of it all, right? Because the history of this is, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects. Because I don't think many people are going to look at MS-DOS 4.0, one of the single tasking variant, and think I'm going to go ahead and take one of the buggiest releases of MS-DOS, right? One of the most maligned releases, and I'm going to modify it and make it the foundation for a major open source project. I just don't think that's likely, right? Not when there's things like FreeDOS and all sorts of other stuff out there. I just don't think that's likely. So the historical aspect of this is really what's important. And the fact that we have a lot of mangled code is annoying and it's frustrating. But now we have the fact that Microsoft is actively modifying the code to change history, even in little ways. Well, I don't love that. Don't do that. This is history, man. Don't do that anymore. Stop right there. We will include this modification as a funny footnote in the history. Don't make any more. It's history. But there's lots of other questions. I mean, a ton of questions. I'm going to read just a few of the questions I have, because this brings up a ton of them. First, why was building this source code not tested prior to it being released? Why was it not tested after it was released? This is such a big thing. It's such a PR win. I mean, look how excited people got. Look how excited every tech publication on the planet got about the release of a buggy, non-popular version of MS-DOS. Right? That tells you something. This is a PR win. Good move, Microsoft. But why? Why not actually test it? It took me 5 minutes to set up a build environment and hit errors. And then I spent a couple of hours trying to figure out what those errors were and work my way through them. But I mean, it seems like it's worth more than just a few minutes to make sure that this PR bonanza goes off without a hitch. Why did you guys not do that? How terrible are you guys at your job that you didn't actually test the thing that you were releasing purely for PR purposes? Holy heavens, man. Come on. The second, what process caused these source code files to be mangled? My guess is they got copied between a code editor and then GitHub, right? Because GitHub notoriously does mangle certain code pages. That doesn't explain all of the code mangling, but it does explain some of them. So why? Let's figure that out so that way that doesn't happen in the future, because hopefully Microsoft will do more code releases in the future. Now, what all was changed from the original source code archives? Because clearly, even after it came out, Microsoft was scrambling to make edits to the comments. What comments were already changed? What comments were already removed? What all is gone that would be interesting from a historical perspective? Can we find that out? And in the future releases, can we not do that? Can we just leave them as they were so we can really just preserve the history and study the history? This is important stuff. The work that these people did at Microsoft back in the 80s was critically important to the computer history. Whether we like it or not, whether you use DOS or not, this is important history. Don't change it. And why, while we're at it, has Microsoft only released the source code for the 3 least popular versions of MS-DOS? Versions 1.25, 2.0, and 4.0. Those are the least popular versions. Microsoft does not profit from any of the more popular versions. Versions 3.3 or 5.0 or the 6.x line of DOS were far more popular and are more useful nowadays. I mean, shoot, if they release MS-DOS 6 point something right now, let's say they release MS-DOS 6.2.2 right now. Well, actually, I could see some people forking that and making a variant on that and expanding that now just for the fun of it, and it becoming a useful thing nowadays. Why are those being held back? Microsoft is not profiting from those. They aren't for sale. They've been abandoned for years. Why? Version 3.3, who is like, oh my gosh, I'd release MS-DOS 3.3, but we make so much money off of. No, you don't. Why is it being held back? And Microsoft loves to tell people how much they love open source, right? Yet they have released the source code for only a very small number of projects, right? Far less than 1% of their total software releases have seen open source releases. Far, 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 far less. My guess is, and I haven't done the math, you'd get into a tiny fraction of 1%, right? By and large, Microsoft does not ever, statistically speaking, release the source code to their software. Not ever. Now, nowadays, people might be like, oh, Microsoft contributes a lot to open source. And you know what? Currently, in certain areas, very specific, narrow fields, that's true. But the majority of current software that Microsoft releases is all very closed source. The majority of lines of code, the majority of total number of products, and the historical stuff, that even ancient stuff that nobody has supported or sold, or in some cases even touched for decades, remains closed source. Why? Why? The last release, to give you an example of MS-DOS source code that was released, versions 1.25 and 2.0 occurred in 2014. That's 10 years ago. Why has it taken 10 years to release source code that Microsoft hasn't used or touched since the 1980s? MS-DOS 4.0 was quickly supplanted by MS-DOS 5, and happily, and everyone loved forgetting that it existed. And by the time the 90s were kicking into stream, Microsoft was like, let's distance ourselves from MS-DOS 4. Come the 2000s, no one had even touched it. It existed and it was sitting there. But why did it take 10 years since the previous source release to get another source release out of Microsoft when they love open source so much? Come on. Where is it? Is it going to take another 10 years until we get MS-DOS 3.3? Right? So are we going to get that in 2034? Come on. Get up your game, man. And shoot. I hate to beat the dead horse, but why has not one other tech news publication actually tried to compile the code? Or, for that matter, notice the changes that are being made to the code? Or just looked into the details at all? Holy heavens, some of the people that are reporting on this aren't even getting correct what the release is. That's the current state of tech journalism for you. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Guys, I can't be the only one doing actual tech journalism. Can someone else please help? Holy heavens. Now, I don't mean to sound like a negative Nancy here. This release is, I'll be very clear about this, without a doubt, incredibly interesting and important, and I love it. It's fantastic. So thank you, Microsoft. Thank you for releasing this. Good job releasing this. Did you screw a few things up? Yeah, you did. Is it almost impossible to have screwed things up this badly? Yeah, it is. But you know what? I'm going to give you guys a mulligan on this one and just say, let's figure out why and not do it again, okay? If you need any help finding the source code in Microsoft, let me know. When I worked there, I found it in 5 minutes. So let me know if you would like any assistance in learning how to release the source code, including making sure you don't mangle the source files and actually testing it prior to releases. Again, let me know. I would be glad and happy to volunteer my services to make sure that this is done correctly, because the preservation of computing history is important. This is important work, and I thank you for doing at least some of it. Let's do it better. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Microsoft is under no obligation to release the source code for these pieces of software. None at all. None at all. Not a single bit. They have no obligation whatsoever to do this. If they wanted to keep it all locked away in their vault, that is entirely their call, right? It would be the wrong call in my opinion, but that's their call to make. They made it. They can do what they want with it. That said, Microsoft's near constant declaration of their love for open source, including their ownership of GitHub, would suggest to me that they would be eager to release the source for 30 and 40-year-old software that they haven't earned a penny on in decades. Where's the source code for Multiplan? Where's the source code for MS-DOS 3.3? Where's the source code for Windows 3.0? Seriously, 3.0. There's no 16-bit Windows 3.0 market out there for you. Let's go ahead and release that. You may think that's silly, but where is that? This is historically significant stuff. Let's get it out there. If they truly loved the idea of open source, they would. They would do it in a heartbeat. But they don't, which tells me a lot about their actual views on open source. It does. Now, when I worked at Microsoft back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I pushed regularly to release source code binaries and documentation of historically significant Microsoft software. And the old stuff that nobody used anymore, it just made sense to get it out there. It should be preserved. It should be studied for posterity. And back in those days, I got a lot of pushback. I've mentioned this before, but it's just worth repeating. Microsoft management was extremely hesitant to release the code or free binaries or even documentation in many cases of these historic products. And honestly, it looks like that situation has barely improved since then. What they do release doesn't even compile. At least they are releasing something, but what they are releasing, they're clearly not spending a lot of time on, they're putting very little effort into, and they're not working on it or testing it prior to release. Just the same, I'm going to be very clear about this. I applaud Microsoft for releasing the MS-DOS 4.0 code. I truly do. It is fantastic that they did that. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, go release some more. Preferably without mangling the code this time, buddies. Now, if you want to read more of my articles, if you want to read more of the stuff that actually gets covered on the Lunduke Journal that gets covered nowhere else, go to lunduke.com. That takes you to a page I call Lunduke Journal Link Central, and I'm slowly adding some of my articles there. If you're a subscriber to the Lunduke Journal at lunduke.locals.com, you get this really cool thing called this content index that shows all the videos and PDF files and articles that I've released over the years, and they're sortable and searchable, and it's really easy to go and find all of them. But if you don't have a subscription to the Lunduke Journal, you don't have access to that. So what I'm doing is I'm putting them all on this page at lunduke.com. So if you don't have a subscription to lunduke.locals.com, you can still go to lunduke.com and see basically what I call Lunduke Journal Link Central. Scroll down the page a little bit. There's RSS podcast feeds and where to follow me on various places and whatnot. And you will start to find articles, lots and lots of articles on computer history of a huge number of things. I regularly bust myths in computer history. It's a common one. It's just page after page after page. If you like any of the big shows I do, like Linux Sucks, they're all here in chronological order, and almost everything is free to read or free to watch. You'll find some that are just for subscribers here and there, but most everything is free for you to enjoy. So go check all that out. Read a bunch of the articles that none of the other tech news sites are covering at all. At all, and apparently this is one of them. I just dropped this one. MS-DOS 4.0 source code fails to compile. I just put that article up there as well, because why is no one actually testing this? If a company issues a press release, double check it. Right? Don't just copy the words that they told you. Assume they're 100% accurate and right, and tell everyone how wonderful the company is. Be a journalist. Question things. Research things. Provide additional context, additional information and value, and then publish your thoughts about it. My articles include a ton of my personal opinions and anecdotes, sure. But they also include details and facts that call into question the statements of the companies when they make those statements, right? Because someone needs to be doing that. The Lunduk Journal does that. So go to lunduk.com, read those articles, and enjoy. Now, I want to say flat out that I hope that Microsoft releases some of the updated files so we can get a bit perfect compilation of MS-DOS 4.0 out there, so we can really archive it and study it and really dive into it from a historical perspective. That said, since it is possible to modify the files through a bit of work and get them to compile, I know many people are already nose down working on that and making a MS-DOS 4.0 branch that is adjacent to MS-DOS 4.0, and I'm curious to see what changes people put into place for those adjacent builds and branches that are occurring right now. Because hey, it's open source and it's under MIT license, so we can fork it and still have some fun, even if some of the historical benefits are kind of muddled because Microsoft screwed some things up. All right, everybody, that's it for today. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.